Thanks for coming, everyone. It's really great pleasure to be here. I'm coming from a university in Europe, so in Sweden. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about a little initiative we have started in Sweden, which has been quite successful, but also try to tell you a little bit about my research work that we are doing in Sweden. Before, I would like to know how many scientists are here, researchers? Ooh, quite many. And how many developers? Okay, educators? Wow, it's a great audience. A little challenging too. So basically, we started with some questions around like, what if we could build cities in VR and try to understand how we can design future worlds using VR? And what if it would be possible for scientists to work together collaboratively and seamlessly around the world in the projects that we work? Or how can XR facilitate and accelerate what science does and make it easier for us? And how also XR, AR, virtual reality, could actually, and inspired by game-based education, help us to learn more and learn in new ways what we are trying to do. In Sweden, we care a lot about sustainability, climate change, and innovation, and products, services. A lot of these things are quite prevalent in our university. So we really wanted to start thinking about what would be the new mediums that we can communicate the research that we are doing, but also through this medium, try to understand our work better. Are there better methods for us to do science? Oops. So I'm part of this VR Sci platform, which is a kind of open-bound collaboration between scientists and researchers around the world, that we are a community of just enthusiastic people who are trying to do something that we care a lot, which is science, and using immersive technologies to both for research and development as well as communicating science in a better way. And how everything started is that we really are some excited researchers, and we think that today as researchers we are stuck in the complexity of our data and our research and our information, and as fields are becoming more interdisciplinary, it's really difficult to make everyone aligned in the way we work. And also, a lot of the tools that we use today are pretty much based on simple mediums like written communication. Most of the science today is really communicated using written language. But we started to think about that there's more to be done with this, because what if we could integrate ourselves in VR and use those platforms to communicate the way we do research, and do our research by making more people part of our complex work. Particularly, for example, in cases of sustainability, which I work with, and especially in sustainable transport, there is a lot of collaborators, there's a lot of industry interest and also academia to collaborate together to figure out solutions, and we really haven't come up with a common language to align ourselves. So we started thinking about how we could use scientific method, but also bring a bit more art into our work so that we become more creative in the way we communicate our work. And this is because if you look at this, probably you're familiar, some of your educators here, the learning pyramid. It's not 100% accurate, it's debatable how we learn and keep information retention. But it tells us a little bit that basically we have mainly focused toward both education and science in passive communication, that we have used mediums that passively make people consume the knowledge, but not necessarily immerse themselves or be part of that knowledge creation. And today we are looking at ways how we can increase that. And if we want to integrate people in the process, we really need to think about new mediums which are fully immersing people in the process of making. And if we are particularly going to create futures together, we believe, especially in Sweden, we talk about inclusive design. We really want to bring people in the making of those solutions. We don't think that solutions are in the hands of scientists only, or industry only, or citizens to come up with ideas. We think that it's a process of co-creation. And we have seen a great increase in the trends of how actually mediums of communication have evolved. And today we are, it's really bad. The most important part is not visible. But as knowledge increases, this complexity of information, we think that the learning efficiency also increases as we use newer, more mediums. Like, for example, virtual reality right now is top there in terms of having the potential both to create interaction between people, but also immersion, that people become part of this process, and they can, once we feel, as I mentioned before, practice by doing, once we experience what we do, we think that we are able to see things more differently. And so we started around 2 years and a half ago with this girl here, Elena Malatka. She came to me and we started this idea of like, we're really curious to visualize our research. We are doing something interesting. Elena works with energy systems design and I work with sustainable transport. And we both realized that our projects collide really well, but they are completely in different schools. And because they're in different schools, even though we use similar methods and similar data, we really don't collaborate. And we started this idea of, okay, how do we explore this new medium of virtual reality in terms of scientific uses, its potential for both research and development. And since 2 years and a half, we have been exploring basically all possible laboratories and universities around the world that are using this medium to try to understand what is possible through this means and what can be done. And VR Sci Fest, basically what happened is that in this process of 2 years, we have managed to bring together more than 1,000 people in different workshops. We have carried more than 50 workshops with people ranging from top industry leaders in Sweden to kids, 11-year-old kids or 7-year-old kids, to try to think about the future and how we can design different worlds with people in the process. And through this process, we have really come to conclusion that VR has so many potential applications. There are so many possibilities that we can integrate science into VR, and that VR can also bring us new knowledge. We started this process by basically thinking about world building and the world that we want to see in the future. And we see this process so important because if we are going to design solutions, we really think that we need to start about opening up our imagination a bit further and try to think more creatively about the problems we are trying to solve, like climate change or sustainability, that are issues, as I mentioned, quite important in Sweden. What we found out that people are quite creative. Like, people come up with super crazy ideas how to use VR. And through this, we have collected like around 1,000 ideas that can be easily transformed into VR. But what's most important is that throughout these workshops, we have always used the scientific method as a way to inspire questions and ideas. And we have been surprised how much actually the industry and the people outside academia have an approach to how we develop things. It's much different in science, and science sometimes is not approachable to public in a way that is understandable. So we really think that this interaction with people is making things more easier to try to understand what we can do. We can see that people looking for ways to explore and experience the world differently. Because we allow people to think that VR can actually be a medium for any type of idea development, people really think that they can go beyond and ask more questions that sometimes are not practical or possible in the physical environments to test or try. There are also trends that we have explored throughout this time to see how VR can be used as a tool, as a medium. And we see that the main important thing that people think is concerning VR is that it allows communication and connecting people in ways that we have not been able before. And it's also very important because it allows this new understanding of things. Because when you put an image and you share it with 20 people, an image allows you to interpret in a more concise way together rather than if you show people a word in text. sometimes we have different meanings and different associations of the things that we perceive. So people see it as a great tool for collaborating. And what we have also observed is that VR has many area applications. We have identified 8 thematic areas that we see VR can be so useful in science, starting from humanities, transportation, energy, agriculture. It can be applied in astronomy. It can be in information technology, ICT, Industry 4.0. So these are different areas that we have tried to identify. But the more main trends, what we see today in scientific community is that it's mainly used for scientific visualization. This is a case called Virtualetics, is a new database that is developing fully virtual reality using machine learning and artificial intelligence for visualizing real-time data. Then we see uses of VR in scenario-based modeling, which is like what I'm trying to do, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my case, where we're trying to map different cities and different contexts to do research that physically we're limited when we want to test new technologies or new systems. Or, for example, it can be used for interactive trainee, which is like these laboratories in virtual worlds where you can do experimentation free of many concerns, and you can set up actually laboratory environments that maybe physically you would be limited to. And the other very interesting approach is game-based approach, which is actually trying to use games for simulating research on behavior. We have seen that the new ways of, basically today in behavioral science, we are limited by the methods of sometimes collecting data on people and how people behave in different environments. So using VR can be a way for us to explore these dimensions of how people behave when they are put in different situations. And so this is where, based on all this knowledge throughout these 2 years, we have come up with this idea of creating what we call VR Sci Labs, and which is basically an experimental, unique approach to using immersive technologies for research and development. And we have managed to finally actually convince our university to invest and turn a big part of our school into VR laboratories where researchers, students, and professors can interact and develop products and services or use these environments for new research. I'm going to talk a little bit about where my work starts. The idea of having this VR platform is that we need to collaborate because the issues that we are discovering and exploring are quite related to each other. And we want to bring this side of the story into our research, because as technical engineers, we really sometimes are limited by our own tools of exploration. So we want to bring this side of the people into our projects, where we will virtualize and visualize our research into VR to try to understand better, for example, how energy systems interact with transport systems. That is something that we are not able to do yet. We have set up, for now, around 6 labs that are in the making of. We have divided these areas that we think are quite pluggable between each other, where we want to experiment, try to bring our research into the VR and connect it together with each other's work. And we see some thematic areas that are quite relevant for all of us to work together. For example, I work with transportation research. I'm trying to design services basically that will help Sweden become fossil fuel free by 2030, 2050. And in this process, I work with companies, I work with researchers and scientists, and also a lot of engineers to try to figure out how, when all transport system is simulated, how much energy this would consume and by how much we need to reduce by 2050. And what would be then the solutions to do so? And so far we have seen a lot of solutions, but really with minimal impact. So in order to figure out what kind of solutions we would need for these complex systems, we came up with the idea that we need to simulate, to try to use VR and simulate the cities where we experiment with a lot of new technologies, and try to figure out how VR could help us to figure out these solutions in a more effective way. At this stage, it's very experimental, because why I need to do this and why we think that, for example, a VR lab in mobility where we can visualize the cities would be necessary. It's because of the complexity of transport system itself. When you think about transport, for example, there are not just layers of how people move. And the biggest complexity lies when you have cities, built infrastructure, when you have people moving, when you have goods moving, when you have networks, and then information flows and telecommunications on top. When you put this all together into trying to understand solutions, it's really complex given the tools that we have today. We hopefully think that through VR this will be much more easily, because it will help us to see how different things are interacting. For example, at this stage, I'm trying to map out all the data of a whole neighborhood in Sweden that we have for that particular neighborhood, and try to understand, when we intervene and bring new solutions, what will be the energy consumption, for example, of that neighborhood, what will be the movement of people in that neighborhood through real-time data, and try to figure out how this can help me to design better solutions. And in this whole dimensions, what we see is that today VR has really high application possibilities for applications, but then when you go into it, it's very difficult to design these platforms in VR. There are many possibilities, but we see it as a new approach, because we're trying to combine not just this aspect, but also bring, for example, Elena's research into the virtual environment and try to see how these are interacting. At the moment, these systems are quite complex, but we think that we are starting in November to set up these labs, and as soon as we do so, we will hopefully think of how we will solve these challenges. I think I will end up a little bit off, because I would like to ask if you see if you have any questions, but also very curious to see how games and game development could be used in such platforms, particularly because I do a lot of behavioral research in these labs. So thank you very much for your time.